Hi everyone, it's Saya from HustleSZN, and today I'm doing my February TBR. I don't know about you, but I actually find it very difficult to still remember what my thoughts were on a book if I've read it earlier on in the month. So I'm actually going to do this in two parts, half mid-wrap-up, half end of the wrap-up, so it'll be a full wrap-up video. You'll just see my outfit change. So far for the first half of February, I DNF'd one audiobook, and then I also read two books. I'll just start with what I DNF'd, and it was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I wanted to be a part of that bandwagon. Anyways, it's interesting in that there's a really cool setting, and Evelyn as a character herself is really interesting. It might just be like a personal thing, because I also don't like autobiographical picks either. It's literally an arbitrary beginning and end. Like, I don't vibe with that, because if I don't see the purpose for me to continue reading, then I'm gonna stop, which is inevitably what happened with this book. The book uses a plot device where there's this underlying mystery, and that's supposed to be what keeps you going. The problem was I just didn't care about that unsolved mystery. I DNF'd it, but I can see why. A lot of people really liked it. The second book that I read was a poetry collection called Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith. I am obsessed with this. It was so good. I highly recommend this, especially for Black History Month. I wish Blackathon actually used one of Danez's spoken word. They are very compelling and thought-provoking, and rather than just gushing, let me tell you a bit of what I liked about them. So it starts off with a lot of really heavy topics. What it means to be HIV positive, what it's like to be a Black queer in America, what it's like to have an entire society essentially see you as a predator. At no point does it demand that you pity them, but at the same time there's this undertone of rage, and I loved it. I loved it because it was such a contrast with how beautiful the poetry is. It's great for awareness, but on top of that, that little bit of fire behind the words, it's almost like they want to spark this revolution. Reading this book, all I wanted to do was actually start doing something about it. Suddenly I was thinking about when I go to work, how can I change it? How can I question my own perceptions? How can I make sure that I'm not judging people when I see them? Or if I am, to keep that in check. Danez really puts the onus on society to take responsibility for the things that they've done and to try to change that. If I had to give this a how abstract, how difficult is it, I always understood what the message was. There were definitely times where the prose was a bit metaphorical, and I had to reread it a couple times, I'll be honest, to fully get it. And there are definitely times where I didn't fully understand what it was a reference to, but I always understood the poem and I always got the message. If you've never read poetry, this might be a moderate degree of difficulty, but don't let that dissuade you from reading it. Since reading this, I wanted to see some interviews with them, so I looked it up, and actually there's a really great YouTube video, which I'll link down below, where they talk about 5 tips for writers, or that they wish they knew, and I thought some people who like writing would find that helpful. Some of their poems they've performed as spoken word, and whew, they're really, really, really good. Reading it is great, you'll get chills, but I highly suggest actually watching the spoken word performances. My favorite one is Dear White America. Even the performance really shows you what I mean about how it's talking about heavy topics, and it also talks about the anger and the resentment that's been building up for years in a lot of these people. It's so good. It's so good. I'm already getting chills just thinking about you watching them, so I'll link them down below. Be sure to check them out. A lot of people talk about The Hate U Give and how it opened a lot of people's eyes to certain things. Despite the fact that I'm so happy for Angie Thomas getting all the love and for a Black author being #1 on New York Times bestseller list for over 100 weeks now, when I read that book, I just never got that eye-opening experience. To me, it just felt like this was all common sense, which it wasn't. And I now recognize that I think it's just my perspective going in influenced how I read that book and how I saw it. I feel like I had with this poetry collection what a lot of people had with The Hate U Give, in that reading this, it took topics that I thought I knew. It took topics that I thought I was sensitive towards and really made me question it. And even just what the diagnosis means to someone. Despite the fact that there's treatment and risk of transmission is actually quite low and things like that. We actually recently had a lecture on HIV, and so we were learning in an ideal world with all the medications and taking them appropriately, and HIV isn't necessarily the disease that it used to be way back in the day. So I came out of that lecture quite hopeful. And yet, reading this, I was just because I go to that one class and I've started to see that HIV is something that can be controlled, society doesn't feel that way. When a person gets the diagnosis, they might still be hit with all of those like thoughts and stigma that's associated with it. I don't want to give too much away because I want you to be able to read the book, but some of the imagery that's used, it really makes you think about the impact of that diagnosis and the way it impacts other aspects of your life. I think there's something of value for everyone in this book. And then my final read was Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri. If you watched my Independent Bookstores of Toronto vlog, then you'll know that this was recommended to me by one of the workers at Back of Phoenix, and I'm happy to say that it did not disappoint. This book though, I don't think will be for everyone. So I'll start with the premise and then I'll let you know like what I liked about it so you can kind of decide if you would like it. Our main character Mare lives in a world where there used to be two clans of people, and then one of these clans conquered the other clan. Mare is kind of biracial in that she's half one clan, half the other clan. She actually is raised as a noblewoman. Let's just say that she's forced into a marriage and the story kicks off from there. So things that I liked about this book, I loved the romance. The romance is a prominent part of the novel, but it never felt too overwhelming, and it never felt like it took away from the main character's like other priorities. It wasn't insta-lovey at all, in my opinion. The pace is kind of slow. I personally really like that because I like taking the time to get to know the setting, get to know the people, get to know the conflict, and really appreciate what's going on. Even though it was slow, I never felt like the writing was dense. You know, some books you feel like you're reading forever and you've used so much brain power and you check and you've only really read 5 pages. This was one of those books where I felt like I hadn't been reading for so long, and then I'd look up and I'd actually read like 20 pages. It's a really fast read because of the way it's written, despite the fact that it's actually a slow-paced novel. I will say, even though it's not super flowery writing, there were definitely times where I felt like it was just a tiny bit heavy on description, but that was only a handful of times, and for those parts, I just kind of skimmed the paragraph and kept going. I really like character-driven stories. Way more than plot-driven stories. This book actually is kind of half-half, but a bit more plot as opposed to characters. And specifically, even though I really liked the characters, there's nothing that made me 100% connect with them. I also think part of it was that a lot of the conflicts that happen in this book are from like the setup of the setting, and it's almost like different tropes that are being used to create conflict. The tropes in and of themselves were ones that I enjoyed, but it was almost like if anyone else were put in that situation, I'd still be as invested to see how they react, because it was just really interesting as a scenario. Whereas I personally like books where I really love the characters and it's them specifically that I want to see how they navigate a certain situation or how they navigate a certain conflict. That took away a bit of the uniqueness of it, despite the fact that it has great world building and it's unique in a lot of other ways. I'm going to cut to part 2 now. For the second half of February, I read 3 books, so 2 audiobooks and 1 physical. The first audiobook was The Naturals, which I actually had seen on Carrie's channel, so I will link the video down below. It's about these kids who have powers who essentially help like the FBI find bad people. Kerry says kind of like Criminal Minds, and she was totally correct. It was pretty fast paced, it was good, the characters were really great. I think it actually starts off stronger than it ends. By the end of the book, I felt like it was trying to do too many things and it maybe needed a bit more time to explore some of the stuff that it was trying to do. The entire like Criminal Minds aspect of it was super fun. There are definitely some loose ends, and if it's a series and they're gonna explore it later on, then that's totally fine. But if it's just a standalone, there's definitely a couple parts of it that are a bit unanswered for me. And then the other audiobook that I listened to was The Poet X. It was fabulous. I highly recommend the audiobook, which I think is what everyone's saying, because the whole thing's in spoken word, and when you listen to it, I think it just takes the experience like from down here to up here, you know what I'm saying? Actually, Jessie from Books and Bowties has a great reading vlog, and I think she hits on all the great stuff already, so I'll also link that video down below. The only thing I will add to that is that like I'm always watching out if there is a physician in a book or they're mentioned, whether or not it's assumed they're male or if they happen to make it female, and this book does make them female. That's another win for the book that I want to point out. And then the last book that I read was The Gilded Wolves. The biggest question for this book really is it another Six of Crows? Is it worth the hype? If it is like a Six of Crows, is it better than Six of Crows? Unfortunately, I think it's kind of not in its favor that it's being compared to Six of Crows. I totally see the connections, but unfortunately, if that's the sole question and the only reason someone's going into it, I don't think it lives up to the Six of Crows. The Six of Crows was just such a solid piece of work. Like, this has flaws, but I do want to get into what I did or didn't like about it. So if you don't know, it's kind of the same concept in that there's like this gang of misfits and they perform heists. I think the characters were really great in this book, and that was probably my favorite thing, is that even though I felt like the plot was weak, the characters are really great in this book. They do at first glance seem like they're the exact same people as those that are in Six of Crows, especially the main couple. They're very similar to Kaz and Inej at first glance, but actually once you read it and give the book a chance, I think that there's enough distinctions between the two to see that that's not the case. And I would argue that because Inej happens to be POC and Layla from here just happens to also be POC, and they're both brown girls, that link is kind of easy to make because they don't have a lot of POC characters. But I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the white characters in all sorts of other books kind of seem the same too. So I actually don't think that Layla and Inej are that similar, but they are both brown girls and they are both leading ladies. And I think that even though the circumstances around, so Severin and Layla are the kind of the Kaz and Inej of this book, the circumstances in which they find themselves are similar, but I do think the characters are quite different. Especially Kaz and Severin, I think, is a really interesting dichotomy because Kaz is a total monster who's completely turned off his morality, whereas Severin seems to be like still much more in tune with his morality, and he's just put into positions where he has to make these decisions. And because of that, you actually see him struggle a lot more. In some ways, Severin's story and his dynamic with the group I found more interesting than Kaz, just because it was a little less black and white. I also felt like the romance in this was really great. My biggest issue with this book is that it is ultimately very confusing, and I think most people find like they kind of go on a treasure hunt, if you will, in the book, but the treasure hunt is based off of like old mathematical clues and like pattern recognition and breaking codes, things like that. But the thing is, that part could be confusing in some ways, but actually if you've read any sort of, like even Dan Brown, if you've read Angels and Demons or the Da Vinci Code, I think that you'll realize that all the codes that were picked and all the patterns that were picked ended up being like the most simple form of them. So I was a little unimpressed with that part. I think the confusion though for me was that at the end of the day, I really didn't understand the world that they were in. I didn't even really understand the time period until towards the end. At first I thought they were in the 1800s, which is fine, but then the way they talk is so similar to people today, and there are so many examples of this. There are times where people say stuff like, it's my aesthetic, or something about boning someone else. And then there was another time where a character said, I'm quaking. And I was like, these are such current terms, so it makes no sense that these kids in the 1800s would be using that slang. So every time that happened, it kind of threw me out because they talk and act like people from the current era, but I think it takes place in the 1800s. I also just like didn't really ever understand where they were, what the event was. Like they'd be at these parties and I never really understood what the parties were, and that could be me not paying attention, but I just never understood the world, the magic system. I never really understood the backstory of the four houses. Oh, and finally, I will say the dialogue in this book is super, super, super cringe, and I think that if you're gonna stop reading the book, like, that'll be the reason you stop. It took me about 150 pages to finally get used to her writing. So all in all, I'd probably give this like a 3. It starts off definitely as a 2.5, but ends kind of towards a 3.5. And yeah, that was my entire February reading month. Let me know what you read, what you thought, and I'll see you soon. Bye!